Hey guys, my name is Armando Vera Carvajal, and I am the program director here at the Newchip Accelerator. Today, we have a very, very special guest joining us here at Newchip to talk about global innovation through entrepreneurship and startup investment. I'd love to give a warm welcome to Nihar Neelakanti, an investor from the Kauffman Fellows. Nihar, thank you so much for joining us. Before we dive in, I'd love to share a quick bio on who you are, to share some context with our global audience that is tuned in today for Demo Day. Nihar Neelakanti currently splits his time between the Kauffman Fellows Fund and the Kauffman Fellows. He works on new strategic initiatives and opportunities for the organization, produces the Arena podcast, and leads the KF Journal, which is one of the most widely acclaimed publications in the venture capital industry. Established in 1995 and based in Silicon Valley, the Kauffman Fellows program is a 2-year transformative opportunity designed to radically accelerate innovator success through self-reflection, peer learning, mentoring, and a structured curriculum taught by venture capitalists and global thought leaders. Kauffman Fellows Fund is now the venture capital fund of Kauffman Fellows, and its investments include Zoom, which IPO'd, Carta, Tally, Grow, Sidecard Health, and many others. Previously, Nihar was an analyst at Correlation Ventures, where he focused on sourcing and investments in Los Angeles. Nihar graduated from USC with a bachelor's in business administration. He's an avid lover of the arts, and he will never turn down an opportunity to meet a soon-to-be-discovered artist or purvey the newest coffee shop. Nihar, it's a real pleasure to have you here today, not just because you bring a wealth of knowledge on startup investing, but also because today is the kickoff of our online demo day for Q3 of 2020. And we have right now hundreds of startup investors, VCs, angels, and entrepreneurs from around the world watching this interview right now.
Oh, wow.
Thank you for being here right now.
It's a real honor. Thank you for having me, Armando. And great to meet all the people in the cohort.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Nihar, you've played a major role in everything that the Kauffman Fellows does, all the way from diversity research to the globalization of venture capital. For some quick stats to everyone in the audience, the Kauffman Fellows currently has over 700 fellows in over 50 countries in the world. It has over 200 firm founders, more than 400 venture firms represented, over 15,000 deals done, and more than 800 billion, I said billion, $800 billion raised by fellow firms at Kauffman Fellows. Wow. I mean, that's a pretty formidable track record in the world of venture capital. And you, Nihar, are a key part of all of this. So
a tiny part. Yeah.
Humble brag, but you really are a big part of this. To start this talk off, tell us a little bit more about how Kauffman Fellows started and what role it plays today in the world of entrepreneurship and venture capital.
Absolutely. So Kauffman Fellows, as you were saying, was founded in 1995, 25 years ago. Really, the mission for Kauffman Fellows, like the vision for it, was birthed out of the Kauffman Foundation. I'm sure you've heard of this foundation. Ewing Marion Kauffman founded the Kauffman Foundation several decades ago with sort of one big mission. Him and the family believe that entrepreneurship is this major life force, right? Not only is it a key driver of the economy, but it's also one of the greatest ways for individuals to realize personal fulfillment. Something that I think all of us here, one of the big reasons why many of us are trying to start businesses, right? And so when you think about like the impact entrepreneurship has in society, it's enormous. I mean, forget just the companies and the innovations that we have, but like when we look back at the past 10 years, right, US data shows us that all new net job creation over the past 10 years is due to companies less than 2 years of age, right? That means, seriously, startups are the greatest driver of new job creation in this country and around the world. So, right? So we feel like we have this huge sense of purpose, not only to serve innovation, but because it's a real job creation engine, right? And so, in 1995, around that time, the foundation started looking at this thing in Silicon Valley, right? And this new era of technology, information systems, et cetera, software, and started reshaping or rethinking the narrative of how a venture capitalist what a venture capitalist should do for entrepreneurship, right? And so you can see a venture capital investor as purely capital. We don't see it that way. We think that venture capitalists truly have a responsibility to partner with great founders in building, the innovations of tomorrow. And so while founders are oftentimes should be spending their time getting to product market fit, there are all these other things I have to worry about: recruiting, fundraising, et cetera, acquiring customers, things like that. And we wholeheartedly think that a great venture capitalist partner, a great investor, can play a role in helping not only advise, but also execute on many of those things. And so we really see this relationship between the investor and the founder in a real partnership, right? And so we happen to think, right, through this fellowship program, that's what the fellowship program was started for, right? To radically reshape sort of the narrative around investors and help accelerate investors so that they can help founders have a greater impact in society. And so we think that if through this fellowship, right, like through this 2-year program, we actually think that if we can make a tiny impact on these investors, then they can help founders lead with greater integrity and excellence and magnify its impact in society. Because it goes back to this whole job creation thing that we're talking about, right? So this is how we feel like we can make a dent on the universe. And it's, I'm incredibly proud to play an exceptionally small part of that. This is a huge network of people, but that's what we do. And that's what we believe in. And, we fight for entrepreneurship.
I love that. And you touched on something that I've seen through the Kauffman Fellows, emails, blogs, talks. Be different, question everything. That's something that you hear a lot at Kauffman Fellows. This is a core idea of the program. Tell us what this means, not just for you, Nihar, at Kauffman, but also someone who is plugged into the global startup ecosystem.
So I think entrepreneurship thrives when people constantly challenge the status quo, right? If we're content and satisfied with what we have today, with the ideas that we have today, with the inventions that we have today, we won't actually be able to solve the problems of tomorrow. So when I think about be different, question everything, I think it's about challenging the status quo consistently, repeatedly, and with passion, right? And so that's what I think about that statement. Now, when we look at this time today, this great pandemic, for example, there's lots of new consumer behavior shifts. There's a great migration of people, right? There's a whole future of work like you and I are doing. I wish we could have done this in person, right? But what I'm trying to say is that the times change, right? And human beings evolve. And we're going to constantly, entrepreneurs really have this responsibility to push the ball forward, to better enable our lives to adapt, grow, and thrive. And so and it starts with being different and questioning everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And could you give us a few examples of some of the fellows in Kauffman that have exemplified that to its fullest extent?
Some fellows. There are a lot of fellows. So quick thing about, the fellows, right? So Kauffman Fellows are not only partners at leading firms like Kleiner Perkins, Sequoia, et cetera, but they're also emerging managers in very exciting markets. And so one big trend that I can bring up, for example, is since 2015 or 2016-ish, I don't totally quote me on it, somewhere around the mid last decade, right, over 50% of venture dollars are now going outside of the United States. Okay. Think about that for a second, right? For a long time, we've believed that Silicon Valley in the United States has had this sort of stronghold on innovation. It's not exactly true anymore, right? There are great founders all around the world. Like Elon Musk, several decades ago left South Africa, right, to come to the United States. You don't need to do that anymore, right? And the data shows it. Over 60% of venture dollars are outside of the United States. We have Kauffman Fellows in places like Palestine, right, in Israel. We have people in Japan and India and China. And I think a big part of what we do is spur entrepreneurial ecosystems globally, because innovation isn't just a stronghold here in the United States. Frederick Castle is an investor, Kauffman Fellow. He's one of the GPs at Crandom, which is a firm in Europe. And they were one of the principal investors in Spotify a decade ago, right? This was sort of pre-mobile phone. The music industry at the time was sort of controlled by the labels, and then Apple was really the big sort of driver of, distribution. They totally rethought it, right? And now we have this amazing streaming service that, you and I can go on a road trip or on Big Sur and listen to great music without paying on a dollar by dollar basis. The same with Netflix, same with all these amazing companies. And so I feel like I'm rambling right now, but to bring it back to the original question, Kauffman Fellows are constantly trying to back founders in different geographic locations who are pushing the status quo of industries.
Right. And that's what makes Kauffman, and I love that. I mentioned a little bit earlier when I was introducing you that you've played a part in diversity research. Kauffman Fellows has shown a strong commitment to diversity and actively recruits women and minorities for its program. I really value this, not just because I'm Mexican in America, but I personally value diversity a lot at Newchip. It's what makes us strong. It's what makes us innovative. But I absolutely believe that it's necessary at the whole for innovation and sustainable progress of humanity. But why do you think the venture capital and entrepreneurial community needs to take diversity and inclusion much more seriously today?
2 reasons. I think it takes a diverse perspective in order to see new ideas, new products, new services that a homogeneous team fundamentally can't, right? Secondly, there's actually a really strong business case. So we actually did this whole study, our team at Kauffman, we did the study looking into returns from diverse teams compared to homogeneous all white teams. We found that when you look at the realized exits, right? So when companies exit and have an outcome either through M&A or IPO, when we look at when we look at the founding teams, right? When we compare all white founding teams to diverse founding teams, right? So having a mix of people from different ethnic backgrounds, we find that at exit across the board, that diverse founding teams actually have a 30% higher realized multiple upon exit. That's huge. Yeah. There's actually a real business case here, right? Like when you have people that come from diverse backgrounds and you put them in a room, you're going to get greater innovation. You're going to get new perspectives, new ideas, right? And so that's actually very much shown in the data. And so I think there's a real business case here. A lot of people look at, diversity I think there obviously is a huge social imperative and we have a huge responsibility to do it, but there is a strong business case and there are returns in this. And I think that that's what investors need to realize and recognize.
No, and I absolutely agree. How can entrepreneurs, especially, those that are not currently in the Kauffman Fellows program, what advice would you give them to think more critically about diversity and inclusion? Aside of being a business case, how can they take those steps to become that diverse team?
So as an entrepreneur looking to increase diversity in their team?
Correct.
Yeah. So I think this is something that I think about sometimes, but at the startup level, even at VCs, we tend to hire people that we know, right? Or through our sort of networks. The problem is obviously that there's a lot of, when we look at purely our networks, they tend to they may not be the most diverse, right? If you went to a certain school, you grew up in a certain area, you worked at a certain place, right? Suppose you went and worked at Google or McKinsey or something. You're going to try and pull people and recruit people from those networks they may end up being more homogenous. Right. And so I think it takes, I think it's important that the leadership at a startup, the CEO, the leadership, right? That from the very beginning, they actually have recruiting policies where they go out of their way to try and loop in people from diverse backgrounds and ethnically diverse places and gender diverse places. It's very important. I know Google tried to do that very early on, right? And that's where you find Marissa Mayer and Sheryl Sandberg, right? Who have then left to go and do other things. Google from the beginning, they could be better. We could all be better, right? But they were a company that very actively tried to recruit women early on. I think it's a great case study. So I think it's being very intentional in recognizing that there are structural problems in hiring from your network, although there are benefits to it, but really truly going out of your way to attract, diverse candidates. And they're there, by the way. part of our study was we looked at, at startups, you tend to have people that are highly educated and came from a select number of institutions, right? And so there has been this argument that there's this pipeline problem, right? That there aren't enough, Latinx people or African Americans, et cetera, in the pipeline. They say, well, it comes down to education, right? It comes down to, that's not true. When you look at those groups of people, they actually achieve similar levels of educational attainment as a percentage of the population of the United States at these institutions. They're not the best; they could be better. But what this really says is that those groups are actually attaining higher levels of education than we perceive, and they're just not finding themselves in this pipeline. Why? It's because we're not doing a good enough job to actually go and recruit them. Seriously, I think this is one of the greatest, misunderstandings in our industry, is that there's this pipeline problem. It's false. We're just not doing a good enough job. And I think it starts with leadership, being really intentional in recruiting those people. And, why do it? Well, guess what, right? When we look at realized returns, 30% higher.
Wow. Yeah, no, I think you bring up a fundamentally critical point, the leadership part of it. I think it seems like it's missing more and more nowadays across the board. We talked about entrepreneurs in that regard, and you sort of touched on investors. And since we have a lot of investors at VC funds and angels looking at this right now, what advice would you have for investors in becoming much more inclusive in their portfolios and pursuing deals? Because we see some of the more prestigious and renowned funds having cultural committees or having specific funds for Black entrepreneurs or Asian entrepreneurs. But how can VCs, established VCs and investors, fundamentally rethink how they are approaching diversity and inclusion when it comes to investment in startups?
I think it starts by hiring more diverse people on their investment teams from the very start, right? Like, back to this idea, if we hire who we know or we back who we know, we've also done this study where we've looked and we've identified that women investors, specifically in consumer, for example, or in some specific segments, female investors are more likely to back other female founders, or at least teams that have more gender diversity. And as I was saying, those teams that have greater gender diversity, ethnic diversity, they end up performing better. So once again, I think this comes down to, there's a strong business case here that if you hire at the venture capital, partner level, if you bring on more diverse people, they're going to be able to attract the diverse teams, the diverse founders, and the diverse exec teams at startups, and those companies perform better. I think it's back. I mean, I've said this a few times, but it really is a strong business case. And I think that people may be just not aware of it. Maybe it's an awareness problem. But it's more than responsibility. Like, there are returns here.
Right. Thank you for that. And I think it's so important that you talk about this. It's a big topic at this demo day. We have several talks around this topic, and we have several companies actually that are working to tackle these issues around diversity and inclusion. So, we very much care about it, and I'm happy that we have you here today.
I think, I remember hearing a while back, there are a lot of firms out there that have this policy when they hire partners of, we only want operators, we only want people that have built companies to be partners here. There isn't necessarily a correlation that if you've built a company before that you'll be a great investor, although it tends to be a good selling point, right? If you co-founded, like Uber, and you're now a partner here, that's your pitch to founders, right? That I can help you do X, Y, Z. I don't know if there's any data that supports that those people are better investors. In fact, that's one of the greatest dilemmas in VC is it better to be an operator background VC or a career VC? I don't think there's any data truly to support that one results in greater success or the other. But having this requirement of having an operator background, it may actually make this pipeline or this pie of people that you may recruit smaller. Andreessen famously, right, for a very long time, only hired partners that had that were operators before or had built a company. And when you look at that market of people that have built companies in the Valley, you find a lot of white or Asian men. Right. And so when you say, well, why like, how do you, but when you, how do you bring in more diverse partners? Well, if you have that requirement, then you're not going to get them. And since that, I know that they've changed that rule, right? And it seems to be working fabulously for them. So that's like one way that you can, so there are firms that have certain requirements that can be reshaped or rethought based on new information.
Yeah, no, I mean, very, very good points there. And on a very similar note, Kauffman, as one of the most prestigious institutions in the world for investor education, how do you define a world-class investor, and what does Kauffman believe is required to become one?
Yeah, so I think one, it's having a novel, contrarian investment thesis that's original. I know those are all synonyms, but like to some degree, but truly having a strong point of view on where the world is headed, and having a very, really well thought out novel investment thesis. And so this doesn't necessarily mean like a vision for markets or sectors. You could also rethink how venture capital is done, right? And so having a strong, investment thesis is really important. It's one. The second thing is, which is the most important thing, character and values. Always. Whenever we recruit at Kauffman Fellows, that's the first thing that we look for, right? Is, does this person have true empathy for founders, for innovation, and for others, right? That's exceptionally important. I mean, we are more than the companies that we back, and entrepreneurs are more than the companies that they build. We are human beings. And I think it's really important that when we partner with other people, work with others, that we realize that, because there's more to this game than just making money or building things, right? So we truly look for character and values first, values fit. It's not culture fit. We actually want people that are different, right? It's actually, this is a small tangent, but like people oftentimes say, oh, we're looking for a culture fit. I'm not a big fan of that statement, because also when you say we want a culture fit, it's like saying, let me hire people that look just like me and sound just like me. Exactly. And then you don't get that diversity. You actually don't want people that are like you. You want people that are different from you, but you want to be aligned on the same values. That's key. And so actually another tangent, but like, I think some of the best investors in Kauffman, like Jason Green from Emergence Capital, for example, he'll always say that, and they have one of the best track records in enterprise software SaaS period. And I think they were consistently ranked the best venture fund for the past few years, period. They led the A of Zoom. They were early investors in Box, et cetera, whatever. And he'll always say, we bet on values-driven people, right? Markets, products, et cetera, second. We're betting on people. And this is really important when you think about it, because like, back to this whole job creation thing, right? Like when you do build a company that ends up morphing and becoming this big thing, it's imperative that it's critical that its leadership is leading with integrity and values. Right? Because that trickles down on not only the employees that work there, but also in society as a whole. And we know we've seen catastrophes happen, like with Uber, right? And so for us, it's really about betting on people that have conviction in their values, and that's something we won't stray from.
No, and I love that. I think empathy at the core is something that is fundamentally required to really succeed in anything entrepreneurship, simply because you need to understand the customer, like who are they, why do they want what you want, but also from an investment standpoint. You talked about values, and I know that especially in the business world and startups and investment, we talk about values a lot. And sometimes it feels like it's very nebulous and abstract, almost like paying lip service to the concept of we have values. So what are some of the values that you look for most in Kauffman Fellows?
At Kauffman Fellows, right, some of the values that we really champion and believe in, principally, is one of the things we talked about first, right? Be different, question everything, constantly challenge the status quo. Secondly, we look for true integrity in individuals, right? That they'll be honest and transparent with themselves, with their intentions, with their partners, with the people they work with, truly being aligned and transparent is especially key. Commitment, right? When you go into something, when you jump into the arena with somebody or and make an investment in something, I believe that you need to be truly committed to the journey end to end, right? We're not short-term holders in this business. That's not what we do. We don't buy and sell. When we jump into something, we're in this for the long run. So constantly having this long-term horizon and perspective is important. I mean, this is a very cliche thing to say, but like the often VC founder relationship lasts longer than the typical American marriage, right? It's a very commonplace phrase, but it's true. Mm-hmm. So when you're gonna undergo this endeavor, right, with a new individual, a company, a partner, whatever, you got to be in it for the long haul. And so that means you have to work through sort of your ethical dilemmas, your perspectives, your ideas, etc. And you have to have a real commitment and vision behind all these things. And then empathy is at the core of the whole thing, right? Truly having, I mean, man, this job is hard.
Yeah.
Right. It's harder for entrepreneurs. It's exceptionally hard, right? Like people are working 80, 90, 100 hours a week. It's hard. And so having true empathy for each other and for this vision is very, very, very important if you want to stick it for the long haul. There are a lot more things. I mean, there are so many more things we can dive into in terms of values, but I think it comes down to integrity, character, passion, commitment, and empathy, which is what we started off with.
No, I mean, and that's fantastic. I mean, those are very core values that we look for in any of the companies that join the Newchip Accelerator. So I'm happy to know that that's what you look for as well for investors. Changing it a little bit in terms of the topic, you know, we live in a globalized world today. Small businesses, startups, corporations, nonprofit organizations of all kinds engage actively and to a large extent depend on global access to foreign markets, talent, resources, capital. There's just no denying or refuting this clear and present reality. Yet in the current political and macroeconomic climate, there's been a rising tide towards isolationist policies that could threaten the future of entrepreneurship and potentially venture capital. How are you thinking about the current trends and dynamics in terms of global VC investment?
Yeah, so, you know, global VC investment has been going global for decades. That's been the trend. I think it's only going to accelerate now, actually. You know, gone are the days where you needed to be in a garage in Palo Alto to start a company, right? You don't need to do that. Actually, today, oftentimes we're finding that there's like a founder, for example, in Palo Alto or San Francisco or Austin, Texas, or New York, and they say, well, my head of product is, you know, in Europe or in Dubai, or my head of sales is in Singapore. We're really going after that market. Or my dev team is in New York, but the CEO is in Chicago. Like distributed first is becoming very common. And I think this whole pandemic is only going to accelerate. I mean, we've already seen rents in San Francisco go down by 10 to 15%. Apparently, I was reading the study that said that 8% of people between the ages of 22 and 25 have left their apartment and gone home to live with their parents. Yeah. Right. And so I think that this trend was already moving in that direction. Maybe not the living with your parents part, but this trend of, you know, distributed first was already happening. And I think this pandemic is going to accelerate it. And so what this means as investors is that we're going to have to continue to think global first, right? I don't think you can be I'm a Texas investor and I only invest in Texas companies, or I'm a, you know, Silicon Valley venture firm and we only invest in Silicon Valley. I don't think you can do that anymore. Right. I think that those investors are fundamentally going to miss out on the next, Tesla, the next SpaceX, or the next Google, if they have such a narrow geographically minded, understanding of innovation, right? And so the interesting thing is, you know, there's two challenges, right, to investing globally right now. One is a big part of this business is investing in people when you meet them physically. You develop a relationship physically. We have to rethink that. That's one thing. And that makes it challenging, as you noted. If borders are closing, that makes it more challenging. And so we have to rethink sort of how we identify signal. Like there are ways that you and I right now over video chat, like how do we develop chemistry, conviction, digitally. Those are things we have to think about. And there are some firms that have been doing this already. A lot of firms, like it's so easy to be like, oh, we're here in the United States and, you know, you're a flight away from San Francisco or New York or whatever. But there are investors in Singapore and Beijing, in Dubai, in London, where that's been actually from the beginning since they've set up shop, like Frontline in Ireland, right? Or in Dublin, or Crandom. They've had to be, those venture firms themselves have had to be distributed first. Think about that. And I think venture firms are going to have to do that. So to bring it back, you know, venture firms are going to have to be more global, especially for those who are in the United States, because the returns are going to be distributed globally. And we're going to have to find new ways to determine signal and develop chemistry digitally. But capital doesn't have any borders, right? There aren't any structures. I mean, there are structures that make it a little bit more complicated to invest, you know, transnationally. But capital is global. You know, maybe blockchain enables that in some way. Who knows? That's what I think about that.
Yeah, no, and you bring up a really good point in terms of Texas investors only doing Texas, Silicon only doing Silicon Valley. Do you think that the next Tesla, the next Facebook, the next Google could fundamentally emerge from a different part of the world and be that like global player? I mean, we've seen that with TikTok. Or do you think that those potential 800-pound gorillas will still have to come to Silicon Valley to be incubated and fundraised and grow out of Silicon Valley? Or like you said, is this still just going to be very distributed around the world?
So I think it's going to be distributed. I don't think the next Elon Musk necessarily will need to be in San Francisco Bay Area. I don't think that needs to happen. There are certain hub spots in the world, so to speak, where we see increased investment activity and entrepreneurial activity. These are places like, you know, Beijing, Bangalore in India, Dubai, you know, London. Within the United States, you have hubs like, you know, you have Austin, you have California, obviously, you have Seattle. Denver is becoming a very interesting place. New York City has always been. Boston and San Diego have been for biotech. There are certain pockets around the world where you see increased activity, but I think you're going to see it further distribute even more than that. So no, I don't think that innovation is going to be held and landlocked in certain regions. I think it's going to continue to flourish. I mean, and there's this interesting chart when you look at the innovation index and GDP. So when you look at GEI and GDP, there happens to be a strong correlation between the two. So countries that have a higher GDP, they also tend to have a higher GEI. And so there's a real imperative for governments across the world, countries, if they want to increase their GDP, they should also be focusing on increasing their innovation index, right? And that means by creating policies in place, it could be tax incentives, it could be educational incentives to keep people there. I mean, the United States has benefited tremendously from our open immigration policy for decades, right? Like, there have been plenty of studies shown, like obviously we know the anecdotes, right? But lots of studies have shown that the United States has benefited from, you know, brain drain from other countries because of our favorable policies that have attracted talented people. Governments across the world in this isolationist world may say, well, you know, if you're this super talented engineer in India, how can we keep you here, right? And how can we help you how can we help keep you here and build the next Google here as opposed to going to Silicon Valley, right? And so that's really important because back to what we were saying, like it's new companies that create jobs improve the economy. And so I think we're going to continue to see that.
Absolutely. Kauffman has made, you know, investment decisions in some major industry players, including the namesake platform that you and I are currently on, Zoom. Tell us a little bit more about how Kauffman Fellows Fund approaches venture capital.
Yeah, so our funds, it's very specific and unique. It's not a typical venture firm. So the Kauffman Fund was sort of born really to support the Kauffman Fellows nonprofit and its mission to support, you know, investors in entrepreneurship. And so we make investments with a financial motive, but the lion's share of our carry goes back to supporting this nonprofit so that we can support diversity and inclusion scholarships and things like that. And so our thesis is really betting on, we only make investments in other deals that Kauffman Fellows are involved with. And we think we do that because we believe that we have an information access advantage to those investments. And so when we've done this analysis and when we looked at Kauffman Fellows' track record, unanimously relative to the venture capital industry at large, Kauffman Fellows, realized returns approximately, I believe they outcompete the market average by 2.2x or something like that. It's like 220%. And so we think that if we invest, with Kauffman Fellows, that we'll be able to achieve sort of a superior return, and that's the thesis. It's niche. I know it's not necessarily like we don't have this like market vision. We're stage agnostic, etc. But that's sort of the narrow strategy that we have.
Gotcha. Well, look. What is in closing thoughts here? We've talked a lot about many different things related to entrepreneurship, founders, investors, venture capital, diversity. You sort of mentioned this at the beginning, but I really want to highlight it again and get your thoughts on it as Nihar, but also from somebody from the Kauffman Fellows. What is the promise of entrepreneurship for humanity today and tomorrow into the future?
I think that entrepreneurship is the greatest mechanism and catalyst for solving the world's problems, period. That simple. And I think specifically in today's time or in times of challenge, entrepreneurs and investors can do two things, right? In times of trial, you can go on the defense or you can go on the offense, right? As an investor, what this means is you can continue to back the founders that you know through the relationships that you have with the strategies that you've persistently bet on, or you can go on the offense. You can look to new founders, new avenues, new ideas, new visions, new et cetera, geographies. The last economic crisis saw the birth of some of the most iconic companies of our generation, right? Airbnb, Robinhood, Uber. These are just some of the consumer companies. There are plenty more healthcare, enterprise, et cetera, companies that have done, amazing things for the world, right? In times like this, it's more important now than ever that we support entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurs that are willing to be bold and rethink our future. And that's why I'm here. That's why I think we all have the job that we have, because we think this is a big imperative mission for society.
Thank you. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I can relate to that so much. Nihar, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here as a special guest at Demo Day. Thank you to everybody who tuned in today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of Demo Day.